Welcome to Windows on the World, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information, and no conspiracy theories. On tonight's show.
Okay, so tonight on Windows on the World, we've got a bit of a special. Got two brilliant guests, James Fetzer, Jim Fetzer, of course, and Dr. Nick Kollerstrom. We're going to go straight to the interview. It's about a new book that's come out, that's edited by Jim, and it's called And I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either: The Beatles, Holocaust and Other Mass Illusions. Now, what's interesting about this book is that it's popularising a lot of different subjects into what we would call a conspiracy book. And I don't think this has really been done before, has it, Jim?
Not to my knowledge. Nick seems to believe that it has a nice mix that's going to appeal in many different directions, and I suspect he's right.
I certainly think so. There's many contributors to this book, including anonymous scholar Thomas Dalton, Robert Forreston, Zen Gardner, Sterling Harwood, Dr. Nicholas Kollerstrom, of course yourself, James A. Larson, Jim Mars, Mike Palachek, who does the introduction to the book, Yvonne Wachter, Jay Widener and Winston Wu. So there's a huge amount of contributors to this book. And can you first of all tell us, Jim, what the book deals with? What can we expect when we pick up this book?
Well, it's well said on the back cover, in fact, which serves as a nice introduction to wit. William Casey, director of the CIA, was reported to have told his staff, "Our disinformation campaign will be a success when everything the American people believe is false." And they seem to have done a pretty good job of it, where this book explains how we know that we did not go to the moon but faked it, that Paul McCartney died and was replaced, that we hung a double, not Saddam, that Osama died in Afghanistan, not Pakistan, that the Holocaust was different than historians claim. Thus, this book challenges some of our most cherished and deeply held beliefs. The authors have no axe to grind, and unlike the parties to these frauds, are only committed to exposing the truth.
Exactly. So people who want to hold on to rigid beliefs had better turn off now, because this is definitely not for them. But for most people who listen to Windows on the World, they're going to find this incredibly interesting, because we have talked about the moon landings with Jay Widener. We've gone into that Saddam and Osama. We've definitely covered that. We are about to do an interview with Nick about the Holocaust, and we've also got did Paul McCartney die? And these are all very fascinating subjects. And to bring that together with something like the Holocaust and pop culture, as I said, I don't think that's been done before. But first of all, we're going to talk about the moon landings, the Apollo moon landings.
Now, may I just say, Mark, that the nearest thing we have to a book in the English language on this is the Voodoo History book by Aronowitz, which is totally dismissing anything you might call conspiracy theory and endorsing everything the mainstream media tell you, and that obviously is a big seller, greatly praised by journalists. So in a way, this book is the antithesis of that Voodoo History book.
Yes, but this particular book is really not going to be held in high esteem by the Zionist Broadcasting Corporation known as the BBC. So David Aronovich's listeners, I hope, will not be listening to this interview, and if they are, maybe it will give them a different perspective. But first of all, we're going to go into the Apollo moon landings. Did we go to the moon? So over to you first, Jim.
Well, actually, Nick is a member of the Royal Astronomical Society, and he does have an interest in astrology as well, especially in relation to Sir Isaac. But Nick is a real expert in the field, and he is the most reluctant to come to the conclusion that we did not go. So I would be glad for Nick to offer some opening reflections on this whole situation, and then I'll follow up.
Well,
Jim.
that's a great start, Jim, because a lot of people will think, I can't believe it. Jim Fetzer's given the floor to Nick straight away. So over to you, Nick.
Well, I'm quite open to the idea that a lot of the pictures were faked and that and tampered with, and some reason the astronauts, when they got back, were rather silent and didn't really communicate too much, and could not convey to the ordinary public a feeling that they had been on the moon or any of the drama of being on the moon and going there and coming back. They were all rather silent, and I think this has led to such a view of radical skepticism. Why do I tend to believe, in the article that Jim's kindly published, I have endorsed the view that they did really go there. Now, several reasons. Partly a huge amount of moon rock they brought back, which was very unique and extremely different from anything on Earth, quite large quantities of it, and recent evidence of photographing the lunar bases by lunar satellites from, I think the most recent one is by China. Different countries have photographed the remains of the lunar bases way back in 1969, 70. And partly, I mean, it does seem astonishing and miraculous that they could go out there, could go straight through the Van Allen radiation belt. And I mean, God knows how they managed it without getting fried with solar radiation. Well, they're just dead lucky that there wasn't any solar storm that fried them. They had seemed to have had very little protection against solar radiation. It's as if the whole thing went with a wing and a prayer, but that doesn't in itself prove that they didn't go. There are a huge amount of photographs of the lunar surface, very grey and colourless thing. There's nothing very convincing about the 1/6 gravity. You know, people say, well, if they're really on the moon, they should be able to jump at huge distances, and we should be able to see the very different gravity field that they're under. Well, we see what we did see, that their journeys around the moon and their reporting. I mean, if you want to ask me, is there any conspiracy theory here? I would say that they were programmed not to report on any strange things they saw on the moon. I think they did see very strange artifacts or things that were, unexpected, and maybe they were somehow told not to report that. Maybe they were somehow deprogrammed when they got back. For whatever reason, they didn't say very much. But I would say that there's a huge number of people all around the world who participated in that Apollo moon launch and tracked it as it went over to the moon. For example, Jodrell Bank, the radar station. Now, if you're going to say that they claim to have, I think they claim to have been able to follow the signals, the radio signals of the astronauts as they went up to the moon. And I think there were various amateur radio hams who could intercept the messages from the moon. So for those reasons, such reasons, I incline to the view that that they did really go, and the whole thing was cancelled rather abruptly, with various moon rockets unused. The whole space program finished rather suddenly, as if they couldn't get enough will and motivation and reason to continue it. But my general impression is that what the challenge that President Kennedy gave going to the moon that decade was actually achieved. And Armstrong was a brilliant pilot, and he really did let that space module down, pilot it down by hand onto the lunar surface. Okay, let's leave it at that.
That's very interesting, Nick, and I think you're referring as well to a book, Someone Else or Something Else is on the Moon, which I've read, which goes into the theory that there was some kind of mining going on on the moon's surface, and we've all heard these stories that yes, there was a row of extraterrestrials and the Apollo astronauts were told to leave and all this kind of stuff. But let's go back to more practical things and look at the NASA photographs and the NASA footage. There are many anomalies in there which do not make sense. The shadows being from two different directions, when the only light there would be from the sun. There is actually a very interesting documentary called What Happened on the Moon, where professional photographers and indeed rocket engineers get together and take the whole thing apart. So there were doubts within the scientific community a long time ago about this. Now, if we look at those photographs and the footage from the so-called moon landings, there is this theory which brings another contributor in who's in this book, Jay Widener, who's done a lot of research into this idea that Stanley Kubrick directed those films, which became known as the moon landings, 2 to 3 years previously in studios in Hertfordshire.
Yeah.
Now,
Marcel, this is like the
Yes.
James Bond video Diamonds Are Forever, where Bond stumbles into a giant pod where they're filming the whole moon hoax, and he walks through it. Let's just refer to that as some popular version of the story you're telling us, Mark.
well, it is, and of course people go, well, that's the Illuminati telling us. We're not really talking about that. We're talking about the empirical facts here. In other words, the photographs that the astronauts allegedly took of each other on the moon could not have been taken on the moon, and also could not have been taken with waist-held Hasselblad cameras in zero gravity.
I agree, that is extremely weird, Mark. So let's just expand on what you just said. The cameras they had, you didn't look through an eyepiece to get it into focus. The cameras were held on their chest, and all they did was click to take the photo. And how come the photographs are so well composed and arranged under those circumstances?
And perfectly lit, because the one where the very famous one with Our World in the background and the astronaut on the moon with the reflection in his visor of the LEM, the lunar module, and the other astronauts in the background, I think that is so well composed. There is no way, in my opinion and the opinion of professional photographers, it could have been taken anywhere but in a studio.
Yeah. Okay, let's just point out, Mark, the fact that photographs are faked does not as such prove that they didn't go to the moon, does it?
Absolutely
For
not.
example, there's a story in Australia of somebody
Yeah.
watching a moon landing scene, and she saw a bottle of Coca-Cola rolling across the surface.
Yes.
I'm not denying that might have happened, but I would say the American sort of intelligence services, they will have a plan B, and they will have that sort of worked out as a backup, sort of fiddling fake pictures. So I'm quite open to the idea that some of these pictures may not have been authentic.
Yeah, so that really leads us into a conspiracy, doesn't it? Because as we know, because we're researchers, that photographs of events that happen all over the world are often staged. Those photographs that get into the newspapers are not of the event, and that's been proved time and time again. For instance, when, of course, the statue of Saddam Hussein was going to be pulled down, they basically put another 100,000 people into the photograph. So we know these things happen.
Yeah. May I say that, as you
Yeah.
referred to a book, I think my view is quite well expressed by Richard Hoagland in his book Dark NASA, a kind of history of the moon journeys, and he says how things were covered up, that were the astronauts somehow programmed, but he does insist that the thing really happened. The rockets did really go up into space.
Well, the rockets could have gone up into space, but that still doesn't mean we went to the moon.
No, it doesn't. No.
Just because a rocket goes up, there's something attached to it.
Well, let's ask
yeah.
Jim what he thinks. How does he see it?
Well, I'm most enjoying this, Nick.
I thought you might.
Mark seemed to me to be marshalling quite a few considerations that weigh against our having gone to the moon. Just for openers, Nick, you point out they must have been incredibly lucky to transit the Van Allen radiation belt.
Oh,
I mean, as recently as August 30th, 2012, a NASA spokesman acknowledged that the principal obstacle to a manned mission to Mars was overcoming the Van Allen radiation. But if it was a problem now, surely it was a problem then. I mean, it's not a new phenomenon, right?
Yeah, right.
And of course, you mentioned about the moon lander coming down. One of the fascinating aspects of that is when you look at photographs, the jet thrusters of the lander did not disrupt the dust covering the moon when it landed. There's no, blown out crater beneath the lander where it would be expected. Not only that, but there's not even any moon dust on its feet. They are clear. I mean, this much more appears to be a movie set than it does the surface of the moon.
Yeah, no, I say, when they arrived at the moon, if they did, they found far less dust than they'd expected. They were expecting huge amounts of moon dust due to the huge variation in temperature, and they found instead of a really quite a hard surface, a very hard surface with paradoxical properties. There were a lot of, for example, high heavy metal content, even though the density of the moon is very, very low, and they found strange glass spherules all over the lunar surface, which would have optical properties. So the full moon is quite bright. The sunlight reflects on these. So what they found wasn't what they expected. But I guess there is still some moon dust. And as you point out, when the lunar module landed, you would expect some dust to be blown away, yeah.
Well, there's certainly sufficient dust that you can see very clear imprints of the astronauts' boots on the surface.
Boots. And you can still see that today. That is still rechecked by satellites that photograph it, apparently.
That's my understanding is we do not have any telescopes powerful enough to detect those features in the dust.
No, not from here, no. Only satellites that orbit around the moon. They have to go into lunar orbit to photograph it.
Well, let me just add, and of course the moon rover was leaving tracks, except we have photographs of the rover with no tracks in front of it and no tracks before it, suggesting it was set down using a crane to be a prop in space. Right. And one of the best photographs, which actually I only discovered after the book had been published, shows that moon rover tracks beside the lunar lander before the rover has been unpacked from the lander, which is a rather stunning blunder, Nick, that occurred, when they got careless about their filming.
Yeah.
There's another point here as well, Jim. It's quite interesting about that, the lunar rover, in that the way it's meant to have folded up is apparently a bit of it's a little bit of an anomaly, because it didn't seem to fit where it should and couldn't quite pack down to the size that they said it would.
Yes. And Nick talked about a vast quantity of moon rocks. I think that would have been a problem all by itself, because of course they have mass, therefore in the gravitational field they have weight, and more significantly, in fact, Werner von Braun conducted an expedition to the Antarctic in which he appears to have gathered moon rocks that had fallen there after having been dislodged from moon's surface by the impact of small asteroids and caught in Earth's gravitational field. So I suspect that while we did not go to the moon rocks that were produced were bona fide moon rocks. They simply hadn't reached Earth by the causal mechanism that the Apollo program maintained.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, this. We can go at this so many anomalies, and there's very good documentaries about it. But
this is an amusing aside, but it was during my second visit to London, and I believe it would have been in 2001. My first visit, I was so enthusiastic. I realized my wife and daughter would love coming to London. And because her maiden name was Morgan, I selected the Morgan Hotel on Bloomsbury Street, which backs up to the British Museum. And we were there in our room watching one of the BBC channels when, to my astonishment, what came on but conspiracy theory, did we land on the moon, which offered one scientific argument after another about how we could not have gone to the moon, and all the evidence was against it, including some of the anomalies Nick has mentioned. For example, that the motion of the astronauts on the surface, where you only have 1/6 of gravitational attraction, simply appears to be in slow motion.
Slow motion, yeah.
Actions that took place in a normal Earth-like gravitational field. But it's just ironic for the three of us to be discussing this when my first introduction actually came when I was in the UK myself on that occasion.
Yes, that's a great one, Jim. That's a good little anecdote. But the thing is with this Apollo program is there are so many anomalies. And so if we look, so we can look at the photographs, say, they needed studio photographs for the public. The footage couldn't be shown. Maybe they couldn't get the footage back. We know about the Van Allen belt. And of course, the idea of a live signal, I really don't think that's too plausible at that period in time. I'm not sure they could do it now.
You mean broadcasting back from
broadcasting back from the moon? Yes.
Oh. May I say, by the way, so we don't, it doesn't slip past, that your points about the photographs are all spot on. The camera was mounted external to the suit. As Nick observed, there was no way to focus. And yet photograph after photograph is perfectly framed. I mean, it's inconceivable that this percentage of photographs would be so well framed. Were they actually taken, given the arrangement of those cameras external to the suits? And the number of photographs that were taken, even by itself, is staggering, where Jack White, who is a leading expert on the Apollo photographs and who has a website, Jack White's Apollo photograph studies, which you can find online, and which is actually maintained from the UK with my financial support, he discovered that 5,771 photographs were taken, according to NASA, in 4,834 minutes.
Amazing.
Thus, if nothing but photography had been done, such a feat is clearly impossible, made even more so by all the documented activities of the astronaut. Imagine 1.19 photos every minute that men were on the moon. That's one picture every 50 seconds. I mean, It's just staggering. And I love that Jack made that discovery, because it doesn't even depend on the qualitative features, which are already anomalous, but on simple elementary quantitative considerations.
No, that's absolutely right, Jim. And having looked into this, my personal view, and I want to get your personal views on this as well, so we can have a voting procedure as we go along. I personally don't think we went to the moon. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I think we did, yeah.
Okay. What about you, Jim?
Not a chance, not a chance.
You're outnumbered on this one, Nick.
I am, yeah, right.
There are other wonderful chapters here, by the way, on the moon landings, where I'm even skeptical that any photographs could be taken at all because of the effect of cosmic rays on the photographic plate. So I'm skeptical that photography would have even been possible on the moon, not to mention the vast stock of anomalies. But there's a wonderful chapter here by Winston Wu where he offers 35 proofs that we did not go to the moon, Mark. 35 proofs from Winston Wu. And it's just an absolutely classic chapter on the moon landing hoax. It's fascinating.
So does he see all the astronauts as sort of totally deceptive? Does he think they just went into low Earth orbit? Does he think they did get up into those spacecraft? Or what is he suggesting happened?
It was all staged, and it was all filmed in a studio. And Jay Wiedner has a chapter here about how it appears to have been done using what's known as front screen projection by Stanley Kubrick, to which you alluded earlier, Mark.
So all of the astronauts were just actors pretending. Is that
yes, which is why which is precisely why they were so sheepish at that press conference to which you alluded, Nick. They were embarrassed because they were having to fake it. And these were people who really basically had a lot of integrity. So for them, it was a very difficult psychological.
I may add, I think one of the strangest things is that none of them died from any funny illness. I would have expected a large proportion of them to get the big C due to radiation, prolonged radiation in space. And as far as I know, none of them did they?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the improbability.
24 astronauts were supposed to have gone to the moon. None of them did get any funny illnesses from radiation, did they? Is that correct?
Yes. And the improbability of these multiple visits to the moon going off without a hitch is simply infinitesimal. I mean,
listen, Jim. The Cold War was going on at that time, and if they hadn't gone to the moon, Russia could have got terrific prestige from exposing this fact. If it was all just a pretense, Russia could say, "Look, we monitored this. We've got our radar. We've got a radio." And it just didn't happen. Russia would have said that, surely.
I think Russia were much more honest about their space program when you go back and look at the historical timeline, because they'd already put a man into space, into orbit, and they were well ahead on the space program. But they weren't really bragging about it in the same way that America had to. If you go back, they were more scientific in their approach to what they were doing, and all of a sudden Kennedy comes out and says we're going to put a man on the moon.
Them having lost astronauts in deep space, isn't there?
Yes.
One hears those stories, but they did really lose a few.
Yes.
Bear in mind that the motivation for the space program was to demonstrate American technical and scientific superiority to the Soviets after they launched Sputnik and got the drop on the United States in terms of its apparent advanced state of research with regard to space, where the United States was lagging behind. So the project was launched as a political objective to demonstrate we were superior to the Soviets. But of course, once they realized, given the Van Allen radiation belt and so forth, where Werner von Braun, for example, had calculated you need 2 or 3 spacecraft to do it, and their dimensions would be about 3 times that of the Empire State Building, I think it became obvious that it was impossible to go, and then a determination was made to fake it. And the way it was faked appears to have been captured almost exactly in the film Capricorn 1 about a visit to Mars, which is broadcast to the world through a single grainy screen of a television feed. And, it was all faked that way very cleverly. I think that actually is an expose of how the trips to the moon, which we allegedly, but in fact did not actually take, were presented to the public.
I was just going to bring that up, actually, Jim, because, in my view, Capricorn 1 was the documentary of the moon landings, and the moon landings were a hoax, in my opinion, and from my research.
You want to hear something amusing, Mark? I feature in the prologue a cover from National Geographic about the war on science. And what does it feature but a moon lander with an astronaut on a stage where there's a technician on a ladder adjusting his spacesuit so that inadvertently, while the objective is supposed to be to suggest that you're being unscientific if you don't believe we went to the moon, they're actually revealing how it was done on the cover of the magazine.
That's at the stage we're at, though, isn't it?
Because it is.
The age of media and total lies within the media, it rules nothing like that out. And of course, they are contradicting themselves all the time. So I think that's a great way to start the show off.
So, Jim, supposing this was all a deceptive conspiracy, how many people would have had to know? How many people would have been in the know and kept secret?
Well, Nick, it all depends on circumstances. The Manhattan Project took place and had estimates have gone as high as 10,000 involved.
Yeah, but that was only kept secret for a couple of years, and it was a wartime emergency,
Yeah, but this was the Cold War, and it would have been viewed in a similar psychological or military-industrial framework. So I don't think that argument cuts it, but it's especially important, needless to say, Nick, and I know you agree because in so many other contexts, you base your reasoning on laws of science, that the improbability, for example, of negotiating the Van Allen radiation belt, which remains a problem today, and according to NASA, is the major obstacle to a manned mission to Mars. I mean, we just have to face up to it that, we were unable to go, so we faked it.
Yeah, I do take the basic point, which I think you two are making, is that a real project to go to the moon, you would first put monkeys or animals out through the Van Allen belt and bring them back and see what happened to them.
Very good.
That would be the first stage you do.
That's right. That's right.
You wouldn't just put a bunch of astronauts out there.
That's right.
Well, getting back,
and many have observed that their spacesuits were actually costumes, that the construction of the spacesuits was so flimsy that it actually could not have provided them any protection from cosmic rays, radiation, what have you, to which they could well have been exposed had they actually gone.
No, they'd have to be walking around in lead-lined suits. But I think your point, Nick, about how many people were involved in the project, that doesn't necessarily mean that anyone knows what's going on. Look at any corporation, any military operation. There may be hundreds or thousands of people involved in that with one tiny little job to do. There's very few people who have hands-on experience of what's going on.
Well, I thought there'd be enough people who could, late in life, retirement, write an amazing memoir of, I worked in NASA on the fake moon landing. There could be amazing memoirs coming out.
That may follow this book as night follows day, Nick. And I just observed that one of the most staggering reports we've had from NASA in recent times is that they lost all of their original moon footage. Now, this is incredible in the extreme. Here you have the most valuable footage, assuming that we actually traveled to the moon ever acquired by the hand of man at enormous cost and expense. Classic, irreplaceable footage that has now been lost, and they appear to be in the process of systematically deleting moon photographs from the site, no doubt because modern technology.
I recommend, if you read the Dark NASA book by Hoagland, he does describe a colleague who witnessed this in order to destroy a whole lot of priceless moon photographs, and he said he kept some duplicated some. It may be there's stuff they saw on the moon that doesn't fit in with current theories, or possibly even shows some remains of old, some intelligent life that was there at some point. And NASA can't handle this, and it wanted to destroy footage.
That's a really good point, Nick, but it's slightly going off what we're talking about. In that it takes us into another area of conspiracy. But
that's right, Mark. You're putting your point on a key feature which Imre Lakatos described as a degenerating research paradigm, which is defined by some key principles that you will not surrender, so that you're willing to alter all kinds of auxiliary hypotheses in order to preserve the core of the theory, which is exemplified by Nick's very deft arguments here. But unfortunately, philosophically, it does represent a degenerate state of a research program that really cannot be sustained.
Yes, and just to close this section off, because we've got quite a lot to cover tonight, scientist Bill Wood, in the documentary What Happened on the Moon, had clearance to top secret projects, including Saturn V. He's a rocket engineer. And he said, in his opinion, that at least the footage and the photographs, as we know, were faked. But what he brought up was a very, very important point. It goes to the very core of people's beliefs. Their hopes and their dreams were that we went to the moon, so they have to believe it.
Yeah. And also whether we believe in an international space program, whether we believe that man can get out to the moon and Mars and set up dwellings there. Will that ever happen, or are we earthbound? That could also be involved here.
According to me and Jim, we didn't go to the moon. So at the moment we're earthbound, but you're going to have your moment very soon, Nick, because we're going on to our next subject, which you've been researching. Did Paul McCartney die in 1966?
I'll give you the bare bones on this one, Mark.
Thanks, Jim.
Paul appears to have died in an automobile accident, ironically on September 11th, 1966. When Ringo raised the question, what about the band? They had to ponder the future. Brian Epstein, their manager at the time, the following month canceled any future tours by the band. No matter what they did, it would have been too risky and given away, even if they had a substitute on hand already, which I suspect they did not yet. But by the time of July of 1967, when they released Sgt. Pepper, they indeed had found a replacement. And believe it or not, and I'm not going to give this away because it's such a fascinating story, but James Larson, in my opinion, has actually determined who it was who replaced Paul. Yeah, and of course the names that are typically used is Paul for Paul James McCartney, the original, and Faul, F-A-U-L, for False Paul. But this is fascinating stuff, and let me just comment briefly on the album cover of Sgt. Pepper, because we're at a funeral, and the gravesite is marked Beatles, B-E-A-T-L-E-S. You see the original group, lads in black, on the side, and then you see in resplendent color in their uniforms the members of the reincarnated band, now known as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, featuring the one and only Billy Shears, which is undoubtedly, a name that is a stand-in for the replacement. And in fact, as Larson discusses, appears to have an origin in William Shakespeare, whose own identity was much disputed, as you both are well aware, and where he even signed his name Spears. So the Billy Shears appears to be a play on William Shakespeare and questions about his identity. But the whole thing is unbelievably brilliant. And, I would never have been convinced, but for the work done by two Italian scientists who ironically set out to disprove the hypothesis. They thought they could establish that the extant Paul, who is also referred to as Sir Paul, since it was he who was knighted by the Queen, was the same as Paul James McCartney. And to their astonishment, they proved precisely the opposite.
Yes, that is very interesting, Jim. What I would say to start this off, having met people who knew Paul before 1966 and after, I've never heard anyone within the music industry come up with this theory.
Nick, what Mark is saying is he knows people who knew Paul McCartney before and after 1966, and he's never heard any of them raise any of these issues. And how
one did. One did. A chap called Emile Olare, who was a photographer on the film Help, and he has talked to the people who made the film, this important disclosure film, The Winged Beetle, and also The Rotten Apple. Those are the two which I recommend online. And you can see Emile Olare talking about what a weird business this is, how lovely the real James Paul McCartney was, what a wonderful lad he was, and who on earth is this replacement, and how so many people seem to have died in the process of this replacement. How long most people who might have known too much or been too close to the family have sort of died off, and obviously the Beatles themselves. Only Ringo still remains. So Emile Olare is commenting on that, but I agree with Mark's general point that he is basically the only guy who has. We surmise that there must be musicians who, various musicians put it into their songs. Donovan, the Rolling Stones, the Who. They were amazed by the new stranger who turned up and looked kind of like Paul, but in other ways was so different from Paul. And it's sort of a very mind-blowing thing to have this guy turn up in the world's greatest band and enable the show to go on. Yeah.
But yeah, I think the last point Nick made is the key one here, Mark. Everyone wanted this phenomenon, this culture changer, this most astonishing popular band in history, whom I have even compared to Mozart and Bach in terms of the quality and complexity of their compositions, to continue to go on. The show must go on. And the fact of the matter is, it seems to me they were bound by something very analogous to a blood oath in the mafia to not break the silence of what had actually transpired. But what is utterly fascinating is that the Italian forensic scientists who published the results in Wired Italia, which is the Italian version of Wired magazine, discovered differences in their palates, in their teeth, in their ears, in their skulls, in the shape of their faces, and of course even in their heights, because I put right in the prologue a photograph of Paul before with Jane Asher, and they're very near to the same height, and with Paul with Jane Asher afterwards, and he's a half a head taller. I mean, these are not mere coincidences. These are features of physiological features that are not amenable to change, because while the replacement had a polished look about him, and again I say you have to read this chapter by James Larson, which is so brilliant, so completely brilliant. And you'll see the correspondence where they refined it with plastic surgery that was done in Africa. I mean, it's such a fascinating story, purely intellectually, that the most visible man in the world could possibly die and been replaced, and the world, by and large, not noticed. That's simply dumbfounding.
This is something I wanted to bring in, Jim, because I have a very rare photograph, and it's the original photograph that was in a newspaper in 1962. It was owned by Sun Newspapers, and I managed to get hold of quite a few of these old newspaper photographs, the originals. Right. Now, this was of Paul McCartney at the Dorchester with Brian Jones and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. Mm-hmm. Now, I do agree, and this is my own opinion, that the new Paul McCartney does look a lot taller than the previous Paul McCartney, if there was a previous Paul McCartney, because, as you were saying, Jim, the height of Paul was, and photographs can be deceptive, we know that, but if you take one step in front of a person in a group photograph, you will look bigger. And
Paul was 5'8", 5'9".
Yes.
Beatles were all shorter, and so was John Lennon. But Beatles were shorter than people think they were. Okay.
Yes, same as the Rolling Stones. So Brian Jones was around 5'5", 5'6". Keith Richards probably about 5'8". And Paul, in 1962, did look around the same height as Keith Richards in that photograph, and not very much taller than Brian Jones. So that does give some credibility to what you're saying there, Nick. So we've got a Paul McCartney replacement that's taller than the original Paul. Now, in the music industry, because the Beatles worked with so many people, and they toured all over the country, and of course went to Germany, they went around the world, hundreds of musicians worked with them, and musicians are a pretty cynical bunch. Why has nobody ever brought this out? Or is that part of the conspiracy? When people get close to Paul, are they really sworn to secrecy? What's your opinion on this?
Well, that's certainly the big question. I could add that the new Paul has got green eyes, the full, whereas James Paul McCartney had big chocolate brown eyes, fluttering his eyelashes drove the girls crazy. And once you see the difference, it's very difficult to not see it. Okay, but I think the new Paul has a terrific presence and charisma. I mean, what I found amazing was when the whole Paul is Dead story broke in late '69. It broke in American Detroit, and it went like wildfire through all the gossip on the newspaper. It was rebutted by Paul, as it was, saying, I've managed to stay alive, I'm still alive, in a witty kind of way. And it went up to a home in Scotland with his new wife and kid, and said, "Look, I just want to be a bit alone, if you don't mind, but I'm still alive." And just his charisma of saying "I," of identifying with Paul, and also I could say of not only having Paul's old girlfriend support him, Jane Asher. She would walk hand in hand with him. That was terrific for his credibility, and also Paul's father, McCartney, and he, as it were, agreed to go along with it, to have Paul as his new son, and that was essential for the credibility of that whole operation, because the new Paul, wherever he appears from, apparently Jim's new book is going to be revealed. I can't wait to hear. Wherever he appeared from, he, as it were, abandoned his family. Nobody knows what his family was. He's always goes through life as a loner, and he was, for some years, he was really, really close to Linda Eastman, his wife, lovely wife, Linda McCartney. But apart from that, I don't think he's ever been so close to anybody.
Let me offer two additions here, which is when Sir Paul appeared on Letterman recently, about the time the Wired Italia.
It was exactly the time, Jim. It was within a day.
Yeah.
The day that Wired Italia came out, on that day, Paul was playing on the rooftop of that Letterman place in New York, okay? It was a rooftop concert.
Yes.
And then 2 days later, he did that brilliant, rather brilliant Letterman interview.
Yes. And when Letterman asked him, well, who was the replacement? He said, I am the replacement.
He said, this is me, pointing to himself, yeah. He didn't quite mean to say that, but that's what came out. Yeah.
Very deft. And of course, while Linda Eastman would have stood by him, Heather Mills was a whole nother story. Because
that's a very interesting point, Jim, and something that I think Nick can expand on. Yes, carry on, Jim.
Oh, I was just going to say that, she made quite a to-do over there being a story here that was huge that the world couldn't handle if it knew the truth, and that it had nothing to do with adultery or,
Yeah. She was seriously freaked out by something, whatever it was.
Yeah, and she got $40 million by way of hush money. I mean, she made out pretty well there, all things considered, financially. But it's clear that she was sworn to secrecy, but she said she had all the documents and records, and if anything ever happened to her, it would be made public. So I don't think there's any doubt what she was talking about.
Okay, Jim, could we go back to the moment you alluded to earlier, which is, in a sense, the strangest thing that's ever happened in England in our lifetime, possibly. In September '66, Beatles just come back from their last American concert, which was rather stressful because of John Lennon's comments about Jesus and everything, but they were the band, okay? No question, they were the band, and Paul gives a laid-back interview to Melody Maker, and then suddenly he's gone. Suddenly the world's greatest band can never perform again, can never sell another concert ticket. This is an extraordinary change, and Epstein has to make tortured apologies to the fans as to why the Beatles can't appear, and from now on they're just a studio band, and you never see them singing together into microphone again. That was the wonderful ecstasy of the Beatles, the harmonies those lads created, singing together, John and Paul singing into the microphone together. That is gone forever, okay? And Beatlemania, younger listeners may not remember what it was like, but the whole planet Earth was seized by Beatlemania for 3 years. And it suddenly vanished at one moment in time, okay? And we're saying that is the moment when this modern Orpheus, the great balladeer, love singer of England, he catastrophically died, and because it was such a vast industry of selling Beatle records, the show had to go on, and that was the mystery. And as Jim says, somewhere out in Africa, in a Nairobi hospital, rather strange plastic surgery began on this new fella, and the mystery here is that new fella was so incredibly talented.
Yes.
I mean, many people say that Sgt. Pepper is better than anything the Beatles had done before, and that was Paul and Big Mal together conceiving, getting the basic idea, the circus-type motif for Sgt. Pepper.
I do believe a number of the songs actually had been composed before Paul's death. But yes, it's a brilliant album, absolutely sensational. And I would only add, I'd make this point that Nick contributed a chapter from this marvelous book he has authored, Paul McCartney, 1942 to 66, A Very English Mystery, so that those whose appetite is whet by what they read in our book, I think they may want to pursue it further with Nick's new book, which I look forward to myself with great enthusiasm.
All right, thanks, Jim. May I say, you said about Jay Widener revealing a whole lot of stuff. I think it's fascinating the way the whole theorising and discovery of the Paul is Dead story has happened in America, and England is in kind of total denial and lockdown on the subject. There's no books on the subject over here. Maybe because it's sort of too close to home. In fact, I suppose people would ask Mark's question. You know, if it really happened, why aren't the musicians talking about it? So the Paul is Dead story blossomed in America, and I think that's quite interesting.
Well,
I think another good. Sorry, carry on, Jim.
Between this book, your book, and this show, I expect it will be a topic of conversation in the UK from now forward.
I think it is in certain quarters, but the thing is that if we can get some more evidence on this, in other words, maybe somebody comes forward from within the music industry and starts talking about...
I say the big evidence, Mark,
yes,
has to be this book. Memoirs of Billy Shears. This is published on 9909. It's 666 pages, 66 chapters, and that suggests that this is the only autobiography that Sir Paul will ever write. It's written as I. He tells his story of his life in terrific detail, of becoming the Beatle, of replacing the dead Paul McCartney, of the terrific closeness he feels with the spirit of Paul McCartney, the terrific identification he experienced, and how he's not allowed, he's legally prohibited from giving clues about where he came from. So it's like he stepped through an opaque glass sheet in September 66 onto the stage of history and took over he mended the broken bones, took over it, somehow became the boss, as it were. The others found him rather too bossy. But we could reflect, perhaps, Mark, on why did none of the Beatles ever write an autobiography? Or what about Neil Espinel? Why didn't he, tell his story? What about Jane Asher? Why didn't she tell her story? All of the key characters are silent, okay? So there's something untellable in this story, something that they can't come out with, right? And various dead figures around who might have wanted to tell some sort of story. Suddenly he's died. What a shame. So
even Brian Epstein.
Yeah, well, we don't know. Obviously, we don't know the causes, but there's a lot of people around this drama who, obviously, equally, the deaths of George and John are rather mysterious, with strange, unhinged maniacs attacking them for no discernible reason, which doesn't normally happen with a pop group. So let me suggest that the appearance of this book, I know it's quite expensive, as if he didn't want too many people to read it, but I think this Memoirs of Billy Shears is definitive. He's done it. He's written it as if he's not expecting to be living much longer, and so he wants to start the truth coming out. But judging by the massive concerts he's still giving around the world, he seems to be in remarkable good, robust health for someone in his mid-70s.
And Nick, I must say I agree. From the parts of the memoirs that I have read, it has the absolute ring of truth. It seems to me to be completely authentic. I found it very convincing. It was the combination of the forensic evidence that we're talking about two different persons, combined with what appears to have transpired, the importance of the band continuing, and the memoirs that for me constituted more or less the complete package until in the process of editing the book, I worked with James Larson, where he had the realization after assessing the qualifications of a half a dozen candidates who actually was the person who had replaced him. And I'll tell you, Nick, I'll never forget the morning we talked about it. but because he'd gone to bed not knowing and he woke up knowing. And it was just fascinating.
Fantastic. Wow. God, that's awesome.
This is an adventure all by itself. I mean, that
should sell the book. That should sell the book by itself, Jim.
Well, it's a fantastic chapter. It's a fantastic chapter, Nick.
Yeah, for goodness sake, don't tell us now, Jim. We're going to get the book to read it.
Not a chance. Not a chance.
Yeah.
Now people are going to have to read the book.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Mark,
substantiated by copious photographs of parents and children and so forth. It's a really stunning piece of work.
Well, it's really fascinating. I mean, I'm not a Beatles fan, so I haven't looked into a lot of the depths of this story. But the Memoirs of Billy Shears is written as a novel. Is this the book in which he alludes to coming back as Viv Stanshall?
Well, he's told by his lawyer, get this, that he's got to legally claim that it's fiction, but it's got to have certain fictional elements in it. Otherwise, he risks losing his whole fortune if it can be legally proved that he's not, Paul McCartney.
So that's a good red herring that he came back as Viv Stanshall.
There is a red herring, and let's notice that all Paul is Dead books published so far, I think it's true to say, all claim to be fiction. But legally, they have to. Okay, and then, but he does say. He goes too far, you see. I think he did impersonate Vivian Stanshall in the Magical Mystery Tour. If you look at the last part when Viv Stanshall is singing the Elvis song, Death Cab for Cutie, I recommend you all have a look at that. And that is the new Fall in disguise, okay? So he and Viv Stanshall did have a thing about both like wearing disguises and the idea of impersonating. So somehow the new Fall could fool about in this Bonzo Dog Band. I accept that, but he does go a bit further and seems to claim to be Viv Stanshall, which is very outrageous and absurd.
Yes, it really is, because I actually know people who were involved with the Bonzo Dog Band and bands that were surrounding them, and especially of that era, because that came really out of trad jazz and this comedy era in popular music, which mixed music from the 1920s with this kind of trad jazz and really wacky English off-the-wall humour and surrealism. And I have met quite a lot of people involved in that scene over the years, and I've never heard anybody again mention this conspiracy.
No, it's funny, isn't it? Okay, Mark, one thing we haven't mentioned is the clues that are left behind. I mean, your musical friends, surely they must all be aware that if you play Strawberry Fields, right at the end, you hear Lennon clearly murmuring, I buried Paul. And if you play the ghastly racket on the White Album called Revolution 9, play it back, and it keeps saying number 9, you play that backwards and it says, I buried Paul. And there are things like this that are regarded as quite unequivocal. Oh, they're not.
And of course, the Abbey Road album has been apprised as consisting of John Lennon dressed in white as the minister, and then you get Ringo dressed in black as the mortician. You get George at the end in blue jeans as the gravedigger, and then you have Paul there, who actually has no shoes on. He's out of step with the others. He's holding a cigarette oddly in his right hand. Paul was left-handed, who is the corpse. So that there's a story that goes with Abbey Road, where I find, however, the most impressive is the masterpiece cover of the Sgt. Pepper album, which indeed, properly understood, is a funeral for the old Beatles and the introduction of the new band.
Totally, yeah. With OPD in the middle, officially pronounced dead, and all sorts of clues on that album. Yeah. But if I may just stick to the words, the clues put into albums as words. The Fall Guys were tortured and tormented. They were unhappy because they couldn't tell the truth to the world, right? And the contract meant they couldn't disintegrate, they couldn't break up. The Beatles had to keep going, and they were living a lie, and they put it out in clues. All of the albums have clues. They're loaded up with clues. Wouldn't you expect, Mark, that your music friends would be aware of that?
Well, yes and no, because when you're talking about bands that were touring in the early 60s, going around in the back of vans and going to gigs and meeting up at cafes after gigs, travelling up and down the roads. And of course, we've got to remember that there weren't many motorways then. So bands were meeting up a lot on the road. And people who worked with the Beatles, as I said, I know a very well-known musician who worked with Paul before and after very closely. So there is something I would add in that people who've worked with Paul, they say that they don't really know him. He keeps himself to himself, and he's a bit of an enigma.
Right.
And I do think, though, that there is something in this, and it's definitely a fascinating subject. We're going to take a short break, and we've been discussing a new book edited by Jim Fetzer called I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either, which contains, for the first time, theories and a lot of information and evidence on the moon landings. Did Paul McCartney die? And what about Saddam and Osama and the mythology of World War II? In the second part of this show, we're going to be talking about Saddam and Osama and the mythology of World War II with Professor Jim Fetzer and Dr. Nick Kollerstrom.
Thanks for joining us on Windows on the World. Remember, keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World. We'll see you soon.